The sun had just slipped to the edge of the prairie, leaving a thin band of fading light wrapped around Frost Hollow like the day's last breath. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and the faint rattle of harness chains at the horse stop, moving through the air in slow strokes, as if everything held still to watch the woman step down from the old stagecoach. Mara Ellison stood on the gold dust ground, her hand gripping the worn strap of a leather bag. The dusk light fell across her face, warm brown, touched by the sun, carving each feature into something steady and calm. Nothing about her matched the picture Jonas Ward had formed of a mail-order bride. No shyness, no awkwardness, nothing that hinted she had come west to escape. She stood straight, silent, looking around with eyes that had seen more than youth should bear. Jonas stopped cold when he saw her. The leather gloves in his hand slipped to the ground without him noticing. For a moment, he was sure some mistake had been made. She was too beautiful, too sure of herself, too out of place in a land shaped by wind and metal. The photograph she had sent with her letter had never told the truth. The breeze swept across his back, stirring the old disquiet. The feeling that he had wandered too far since the fire that took both his wife and child. They looked at one another. A look longer than courtesy allowed. A look that tightened something deep in Jonas's chest. A look that told Mara this man was unlike anyone she had met. The moment grew so still that even the horse's hooves seemed to pause, as if afraid to break it. "Mr. Ward?" Mara asked softly, her voice low and slightly rough, as though shaped by too many evenings in smoke-filled taverns in St. Louis. Jonas only nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Mara stepped closer, her long dress brushing the ground. There was no flourish in her movements, but each one carried a quiet grace, the kind carried by people who learn to survive in unsafe places. "I'm Mara Ellison. I've come under the marriage letter." Jonas opened his mouth, but no words came. He only knew he was seeing something he hadn't dared believe in for a long time. Calm. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The mountains in the distance turned violet. The sky dimmed fast, and the cold slipped into their clothes. Mara sat behind Jonas on the saddle, close enough to feel his breath, yet Jonas kept his shoulders stiff, careful not to touch her. Mara understood, and did not move closer. Some people needed time before letting another presence settle into their world. When they reached the ranch gate, a shout echoed from a neighbor's house a few miles off. Jonas recognized it at once. Maeve, about to deliver her third child. "Lord, not now." Jonas turned the horse. "Stay in the cabin. I'll check on them." Mara didn't wait. "I'm coming with you." When they arrived, Maeve writhed on the bed, her face drained, while her husband staggered in panic. Jonas began to shake, the memory of the night he lost his wife in childbirth rising like a breaking wave. But Mara stood at the center of the chaos, like anchor stone. "Bring me warm water and 2 clean cloths," she said, not loud but firm enough to move everyone. She checked the baby's position. Jonas stood beside her, his hands trembling. Mara, steady like someone who had kept many children alive in crowded, poor quarters, guided Maeve's breathing, eased her back, counted the contractions, and moments later, a child's cry broke through. A boy. Strong. Maeve wept. Her husband wept. Jonas froze as if locked in place. He looked at Mara, her eyes catching the lamplight, warm, deep, calm as river stone. "Where did you learn that?" Jonas asked quietly. Mara wiped her hands, then looked up with a small smile. Small, but enough to make Jonas turn away to hide the force of his own heartbeat. "Where I grew up, Jonas. If folks didn't help each other, no one made it." In that small room, with the smell of blood, sweat, and a newborn's cry filling the air, Jonas realized he had been wrong to think she didn't belong in the West. She belonged here more than anyone, and the only thing he feared now was that he might be the one who wasn't worthy. Winter came to Frost Hollow not with a roar of wind, but with the quieting of the entire prairie. The grass bowed. The pines stood still, holding their breath for whatever was rolling in. For Mara, it was the first winter of her life not spent in cramped, heated rooms filled with arguments in St. Louis. She stood on the ranch porch, hands around a warm cup, her breath fading into the cold air, as if she were learning how to exist all over again. Jonas walked out from the barn, his thick coat dusted with frost. He stopped when he saw her watching the sky, her posture like a leaf bracing for wind. "Today I'll show you how to spread feed and bed the horses," he said, his voice even but lower than usual. Mara nodded. She had spoken little since arriving, yet her silence never pushed anyone away. It felt more like a quiet space people had to enter gently. Inside the barn, Jonas handed her a large rake. "It's heavy. Watch your hands." Mara tried lifting it. It was heavy, the handle slipped, and Jonas reached out on instinct. His fingers brushed the back of her hand. A brief touch, but enough to stop them both for a heartbeat. "Sorry," Jonas muttered, pulling back as if burned. Mara offered a small smile. "It's all right, Jonas. I'm used to hard work." That smile held him still longer than he meant to. While they worked, she fumbled more than once. A spilled bucket of hay, a stall door thrown too hard and bouncing back until Jonas caught it with his arm. Each time he stepped toward her closer than necessary. And each time Mara sensed something in him loosening, like frozen ground starting to thaw. In the afternoon, as they led the horses to water, Mara didn't brace the reins tightly enough, and one jerked. Jonas moved fast, wrapping an arm around her back to steady her. She caught the scent of pine and saddle leather on his coat, a scent that belonged to the West and to men who worked it. Jonas stepped away at once when he realized how near they stood. "Sorry, I didn't think—" "Jonas," Mara said through her scarf, "you don't need to apologize for helping me." For the first time, he didn't turn away. Their eyes met longer than they should have, long enough for both to draw a slow breath before moving on. By late afternoon, a sharp wind cut across the sky, turning it metallic. Jonas looked up, his voice lowered. "Snow's coming early. If the wind shifts, we'll stay in the cabin tonight." He was right. Within an hour, snow fell thick as wool. The wind hammered the cabin like someone shaking the door. Jonas lit the fire, the glow catching the hard lines of his face, making him look strong and breakable in the same breath. Mara sat at the wooden table, hands folded, warmth and cold threading through her fingers. The cabin was small, but warm. Too warm for two people trying to keep distance. "It's peaceful here," Mara said softly. "Peaceful enough to be frightening," Jonas answered, his voice low, like wood cracking in the stove. Mara watched him through the firelight. "Jonas, that day, the childbirth, I saw how scared you were." Jonas gripped the chair. "I lost my wife and child on a night like this. Storm, snow, screaming. I thought if I stepped into it again, I'd die alongside them." Mara didn't answer with words. She simply placed her hand on the table, quiet, steady, a bridge within arm's reach. Jonas looked at that hand, then at the woman offering it. For the first time, he didn't retreat into his old fear. Later, as snow sealed the door in white, Mara rose and went to the kitchen. Jonas heard the soft rhythm of knife, cutting board, and iron pot. When she set the meal before him, corn and potato stew with a scent he'd never known. Jonas stared at her for a long moment. This, my mother taught me. Where I grew up, people shared what little they had. She always said, if you want someone to understand you, cook them something that makes you feel safe. Jonas took a spoonful, and for a brief second, he forgot to breathe. Not because of the taste, but because it had been a long time since anyone had cared for him at all. Outside, the snow lay thick as a white blanket. Inside, warmth spread slowly, sinking deep into the quiet places of two people who once believed their lives would remain cold. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a heavy silence that chilled the skin. That morning, the sky was the color of stirred gray water, and the first gusts hit the ranch roof with the sharp cold of needles. Jonas stood at the cattle barn door, staring toward the foothills where the herd clustered into dark patches beneath the whitening wind. They're spooked. I need to drive them in before the storm hits, he said, pulling on his old fur coat. Mara had just brought warm water when she heard him. Let me go with... No, Jonas cut her off. In wind like this, anyone unfamiliar with the land gets lost fast. Stay in the cabin. He left before she could say more. The door shut, leaving Mara alone with the first rising howl that sounded too much like a stray wolf's cry. She stood still for a long moment, fingers gripping the table edge until they blanched. Jonas always moved as if he feared nothing, but Mara knew the truth. People shaped by great loss rarely knew how to fear for themselves. Outside, the prairie had begun to fade into drifting layers of white smoke. A sudden slam made the window rattle. Mara startled and ran to the porch. Visibility was almost gone. Everything white. White enough to feel as if the world had been wiped clean. She swallowed hard. Jonas. The wind hit again, shaking the porch as if trying to tear it loose. From somewhere inside the whiteout, a cow's cry echoed, only to be swallowed by the storm. Mara rushed back inside and stared at the rope hanging by the door. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from something sharper. If I leave him out there, she whispered, breath breaking, I'll never forgive myself. She tied one end of the rope to the doorpost, the knot so tight her fingers burned. She wrapped the other end around her waist and pulled until it bit into her coat. Then, without stopping to think, she flung the door open and stepped into the storm. Snow slapped her face like cold palms. The wind shoved her back step after step. Every time she forced forward, the storm pushed harder, trying to throw her down. She bent low, gripping the rope, inching through the white. Jonas! She screamed until her throat tore, but the sound vanished at once. Dozens of steps later, the rope jerked behind her as the wind snapped it like a live thing, but she kept going. Snow rose to her knees. Each breath felt like fire. Then her foot hit something solid. Mara stumbled, caught herself, knelt, and reached forward. Her hand touched a frozen arm. Jonas. Oh, Jonas. He lay on his side, half buried, his face pale and stiff, eyes closed. The largest steer stood nearby, shuddering, blowing hard clouds of steam. Jonas must have tried to push it home before the wind knocked him down. Mara refused to let fear in. Not now. She rolled him onto his back. Jonas, hear me. Open your eyes. Nothing. Her chest tightened, but her hands grew stronger. She pulled him upright, hooked her, arm under his, and strained with everything she had to drag him through the deep snow. Each step tore through her body. Snow stung her eyes, her mouth, the back of her neck. The rope crushed her ribs, but she kept moving, step by step, as if the world had narrowed to one task, bringing Jonas home. When the cabin door finally appeared through the white haze, her legs nearly gave out. She dragged him inside and slammed the door shut just before the next gust could tear him away. In the wavering firelight, Jonas's face showed itself, too pale, too cold. Mara stripped off his coat, rubbed his arms hard, set hot stones at his sides, pulled blankets over him. "Don't leave me here. Do you hear me?" Her voice cracked, shaking from cold, fear, and something deeper. After a long moment, Jonas coughed, a harsh, scraping sound. Mara froze. His eyes opened, cloudy at first, then clearer, and the first thing he saw was her face, flushed, soaked, fierce, and full of mercy. Jonas reached weakly for her hand. "You came for me?" Mara didn't speak. Her eyes answered for her. In that moment, something inside Jonas broke. Not fear, not the wall he had built around himself for years, but the distance between them. In a single breath, it was gone. Two souls lost on the prairie, now bound by a thread stronger than the storm outside. Winter after the whiteout moved slowly, as if trying to hold the two of them inside the same long, quiet breath. The snow outside had softened, but the cold still bit hard enough to turn every exhale into smoke. In the small cabin, Jonas and Mara moved around each other with a strange caution, like two people aware they had come too near a boundary, and one uneven heartbeat would push them across it. Jonas fully recovered 2 days after the storm. He was stronger, yet Mara refused to let him do heavy work. She watched every step he took, every small cough, every time his hands cooled more than they should, and Jonas knew. He felt her gaze on him like the warmest blanket in the room, but they never spoke of her pulling him through the blizzard, or of the truth that everything had shifted since that moment. On the first morning Jonas returned to work, the cold was sharp enough to frost their breath mid-sentence. Mara stepped into the yard with him, scarf tight around her neck, hands tucked into a pair of old leather gloves Jonas had dug out. "You don't need to be outside," Jonas said, trying for calm. "If I stay in, you'll overwork yourself after nearly freezing to death." She said it lightly, not looking at him. Jonas clenched his jaw, then quietly removed his outer coat and draped it over her shoulders. Mara stilled. The gesture was simple, common for a Western man, but for her, someone who had always kept herself warm by her own means, it felt like a care that struck both warm and painful. "What are you doing?" "Your coat is too thin." "And yours?" "I handle cold better." She held the coat's edge, unsure whether to give it back or keep it. She kept it. Neither spoke, but the distance between them thinned. In the yard, snow lay in thick patches over the ground. Jonas was adjusting the ropes on the horse stall when Mara stepped up to help pull the line lower. As they both bent down, Jonas's chest brushed her shoulder. Light. A second. But enough for Mara to inhale sharply, and for Jonas to halt, as if caught by an unseen hold. Mara pulled her hand back, but her fingers slid across the back of his. Intentional or not, she couldn't tell. Neither spoke, but their eyes deepened, quiet and still. 3 days later, they were clearing snow. The wind pushed back hard, knocking Mara's hood off. Jonas stepped close, lifted her collar, and tightened the ties so the wind couldn't cut down her neck. His fingers grazed her jaw, cold, then warm. Mara didn't move, didn't breathe too sharply. She let him finish. When he lowered his hands, the space between them was less than a palm's width. They felt each other's breath, felt the presence of the other as sharply as if the prairie behind them had vanished. But Jonas stepped back, and Mara, though something inside her sank, stepped back too. They weren't ready, not to touch, though they were close enough to feel it. The rumor arrived from Birch Hollow a week later. Billy Patterson, the friendly delivery boy, brought flour and letters, along with hesitant words. Folks in town are saying, she..." Billy glanced at Mara, unsure. Might not fit the Ward place. Some say Jonas married just to have help. Some say, you two aren't a match. Mara froze, hands tightening. She knew words like that. She'd heard them all her life in St. Louis. She had thought she'd left them behind. But they always found a way. Jonas stepped in from the yard, catching half the sentence. Who said that? His voice dropped, not loud, but sharp as winter wind. Billy backed up. Don't know exactly. Heard it from Mrs. Whitmore and some folks at the smithy. Jonas turned to Mara. His eyes held no doubt, no hesitation, no question. Only certainty. He stepped closer, close enough that their arms brushed once more. Mara Ellison is my wife, Jonas said, steady and clear, each word nailed in place. What people think of her has nothing to do with me. She belongs to this ranch, this home, and to me. Mara looked up, eyes wide. Her heart tightened, hurt and warm at the same time. Billy swallowed. Yes, sir. I'll pass it along. When he left, Jonas faced her again. Don't let them wound you. You have a place here. I want you here. Mara studied him for a long moment. His face was cold from the wind, but his eyes were not cold at all. Thank you, she said, soft but unwavering. Yeah. They didn't touch, but the distance between them closed to a single breath. One breath, and something began to rise, slow, steady, impossible to stop. Winter thinned slowly, revealing the first strips of yellow grass beneath melting snow. Jonas and Mara's ranch settled into its familiar rhythm, mending stalls, checking fences, preparing for spring. It wasn't loud or demanding, but steady enough for two strangers to begin circling each other like orbits that had fallen into the same path by accident. They lived together, ate together, worked together, shared warmth in a cabin where the wind always tried to slip through the cracks. From the outside, they looked like a true husband and wife. But between them lay a thread-thin boundary, present, taut, and untouched. Jonas rose earlier than Mara each morning. He lit the fire, heated water, and set out a warm cloth for her. Mara cooked breakfast, wearing a small apron, and humming old songs from her childhood. Jonas listened, never commenting, but always slowing his pace so he could hear a little longer. At the horse barn, when Jonas guided her hands on the reins, their fingers brushed, light as early spring wind. Mara pulled back. Jonas looked away, yet both their breaths changed. And each evening when Mara cleaned the kitchen and Jonas checked the windows for rising wind, the cabin warmed in a way neither could name, like a home built by people who belonged together, even if they hadn't admitted it. But beneath that calm, both carried fear. Jonas had lost his family to a fire. The loss had not only taken those he loved, it burned away his courage to love again. He feared opening up, feared happiness, feared Mara disappearing like everything he once held. Mara carried a different fear. She had grown up in a poor neighborhood where people left without warning, and she was always the one who stayed behind. She feared abandonment, feared she would never truly belong anywhere. And though Jonas had never shown distance or disdain, there were moments she felt she was only the one who came after, a figure standing beside the memory he hadn't fully released. Their fears tangled into a silence tighter than any winter storm. One late winter afternoon, the sun sank behind the ridge, casting a deep, honey-colored light. Mara was stacking hay when Jonas stepped behind her, his shoulder crushing hers. Not intentional, not avoided. Mara turned, eyes widening, and Jonas stood close enough that she felt the heat rising from his heavy coat. "Mara," Jonas said, his voice roughened by something he'd held too long. She swallowed. "Yes?" He looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time, as if the storm, the fear, the memories, and all the sleepless nights had narrowed to this one moment. "I don't know what to do with what's happening." "Between us?" Mara whispered. Jonas nodded, one painful, honest nod. "I'm afraid if I take one more step, I'll lose everything again." Mara steadied herself on the railing. "And I'm afraid I'll wake up one day and find myself gone, that you'll realize I'm not who you need." Jonas frowned, stepping closer. "Mara, don't. I've been left before, Jonas. Over and over. I know how that feels." She gave a small smile, but her eyes carried unsaid hurt. "I don't want to feel it again. Not with you." Jonas stood still, fists tight, fighting something inside himself. Then he reached out and held her elbow. A light touch, but strong enough to make Mara's heartbeat pound against her ribs. The space between them narrowed to half a palm. "Mara," Jonas murmured. "Jonas." Their breaths mingled. Mara's eyes flicked to his mouth. Jonas looked at her as if ready to cross every boundary he'd built. He leaned toward her, slowly, close enough that she saw her reflection in his eyes. Their lips were one breath apart. Just one. But at that instant, Jonas closed his eyes, pulled back, and stepped away as if running from his own heart. Mara stayed still. She didn't follow. She didn't blame him. But the quiet hurt showed in her eyes, soft, yet sharper than winter wind. Jonas turned so she wouldn't see the turmoil on his face. I'm sorry." Mara inhaled deeply to keep her voice steady. "I know. You're afraid." He didn't answer. She stepped back, her voice gentle but aching. "But Jonas, fear saves no one. It only makes us lose more." She walked out of the barn, leaving him in the fading light. Jonas didn't chase her, but his hands shook. And for the first time he understood. If he stepped back again, he would lose her, not to storms, not to snow, but to the fear he carried. And that fear, suddenly, was the most terrifying thing he had ever faced. The storm came 2 nights after the afternoon they almost kissed. Not the brutal whiteout from before, but a windstorm so strong the cabin seemed to breathe with the shifting sky. The wind cut through the cracks of the wood and carried cold deep enough to defy the thickest blankets. Mara shut the window one last time, her hands trembling from cold and from something she couldn't name. Jonas stood behind her, lamplight casting his face in a quiet, worn glow. Beneath that, something else lingered, a thin, strained tension pulled too long. They hadn't spoken about that moment in the barn. They still looked at each other, still brushed close. But between them grew a widening space, pulling both back toward old fears. A sharp gust hit the door. Mara flinched. Jonas moved toward her by instinct, without thought, without distance. "Are you freezing?" he asked, voice low and rough. Not exactly, I just..." Another whistle rattled the cabin. Mara held her breath. Jonas placed a hand on her arm, gentle enough to break if pressed harder. "Come closer. The fire's dying." He said it simply, but the warmth in his voice touched the deepest part of her, the part untouched for years. They sat by the fire, half an arm's length apart. The oil lamp flickered gold against their faces, the shadows brushing over them like soft strokes of memory. Mara pulled the blanket up to her chest, but the cold still slid under her collar, drawing a shiver. Jonas saw it. He didn't speak. He opened his blanket, reached out, and drew her closer, slow enough to give her a chance to pull away. But Mara didn't. She let him wrap an arm around her shoulders and draw her in. His warmth settled over her like something long missing. Belonging. Jonas rested a hand on her arm. She set her hand on his chest. His heartbeat thudded hard, undeniable. She noticed, looked up. Their eyes met. Neither turned away this time. Mara. Jonas breathed her name as if confessing something, or asking for something, or finally speaking without fear. That day, Jonas said quietly, I stepped back because I thought if I loved someone again, I'd lose everything again. Mara cupped his cheek. Jonas, you won't lose me. Not if you let me stay. The wind roared, breaking something loose in both of them. Jonas leaned down a little. Mara lifted her face a little, and the thin space between them dissolved. The first kiss wasn't rushed, not driven by hunger, only by the quiet care of two people who had been hurt too deeply. But when Jonas's hand slid up her back, pulling her closer, when Mara's fingers threaded through his hair, trembling at his sigh, the moment became more than comfort. It became knowing they needed each other in a way no words could hold. The fire dimmed, light softened. The wind raged outside, but warmth filled the cabin. They lay beside the hearth, wrapped in two blankets, their breaths settling into the same rhythm. Each layer of cloth fell away, not out of urgency, but out of trust, opening step by step. Jonas touched her with the carefulness of a man who had lost before, and therefore understood the worth of what was being given. Mara held him with the gentle steadiness of someone who had always feared being left, and for the first time no longer feared it. No dramatics, no haste. Only two long, lonely hearts finding their way toward each other on a storm-lit night. When everything finally stilled, when their breaths matched, Jonas buried his face against her neck, voice low as a fading ember. You're here. Mara held him tighter, her heartbeat strong beneath his hand. And so are you. Outside, the storm tore across the prairie, but where they lay, there was only warmth, and a truth neither had spoken, yet both now understood. They had found each other, not because of the storm, but because they had finally stopped running from their pain and stepped toward where their hearts belonged. The next morning, the first line of sunlight slipped through the thin curtain like a strand of gold, gentle enough not to disturb the quiet resting over the cabin. Mara opened her eyes slowly, as if her body was trying to hold on to one more second of the night. The night when every boundary between her and Jonas had dissolved into warmth. She didn't feel cold. She didn't feel lost. She didn't feel afraid. The first thing she sensed was the warm scent of the hearth, the smell of Jonas's coat, and the weight of his arm resting around her waist, as if his body still remembered it needed to keep her close against the wind. Mara turned her head. Jonas slept with steady breaths, his dark lashes casting shadows across his cheek. In the pale morning light, he didn't look like the hardened, closed-off man she had first met. He looked peaceful, younger, softer, as if part of the grief he had carried for years had finally found a place to rest. Mara breathed deeply, touching his arm lightly. Jonas shifted at once, tightening his hold around her by instinct. "Don't go," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Let me know you're still here." Mara let out a soft laugh, her heart beating fast. "I'm not going anywhere." He opened his eyes, slow, deep. And in that look, there was no doubt, no shadow, only a quiet light that made Mara inhale sharply. When they sat up, both were awkward in the sweetest way. Jonas rose first, found a coat, and draped it over her shoulders as she reached for the blanket. "Are you cold?" "No. Just a little." She stopped, too flustered to finish. Jonas, for once, was not flustered. He didn't keep the distance he always had. He stood behind her, lifting the blanket's collar so wind wouldn't slip down her neck. A small gesture. But Mara felt her hands tremble. Her heart, too. Jonas paused for a moment, as if wanting to say last night wasn't a mistake. But he didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes, when he bent to her shoulder, said it for him. That morning, Jonas cooked. Mara sat at the table watching him slice bread and crack eggs. He used to cook with the haste of habit. Quiet, quick, tired. Today was different. He moved slow, careful, glancing at her now and then, as if to make sure she was still there. He dropped a spoon because he didn't look away from her long enough to see where his hand was. Mara laughed. Jonas flushed red. Neither spoke of the night before, but the silence itself was warm enough to make breathing harder. When he set the plate before her, Jonas brushed her hand. Not accidental, not apologetic, not withdrawn. As if the night had woken a different man, one less afraid, less hidden, more open than he had ever been. After breakfast, they stepped outside like any other day, but nothing felt like any other day. Jonas walked ahead, then turned back to offer his hand as she stepped down the porch. On any other morning, he would have let her manage on her own. Mara placed her hand in his without thinking. His hand was large, rough, warm. Crossing the thin snow over the yard, Jonas held her hand longer than necessary, and when they led the horse to the stream, Mara realized something. He was beside her, not out of duty, not because of the word marriage, but because he wanted to be. Jonas tied the reins to the post, then stood next to her, their breaths mingling in the cold. "Do you regret it?" Jonas asked quietly, eyes on the snow. "Regret what?" "Last night. Me. Everything." Mara stepped closer and placed her hand over his heart, right where it beat the hardest. "Jonas, if I regretted it, I wouldn't still be here this morning." He closed his eyes, breath catching. Mara watched him. In his stance, she saw every fear he carried, the fear of losing someone he loved, the fear of being unworthy, the fear of feeling too much. But when he opened his eyes again, those fears drew back, revealing something clearer, more fragile, a man who had just rediscovered trust. That night, when Mara finished cleaning the kitchen, Jonas stood at the door, hands still dirty from fixing the fence. "Go on to bed," he said. "And you?" "I'll check the stalls once more. 5 minutes." Mara nodded, but before she stepped into the bedroom, she turned back. "Jonas," he stopped. "Last night, it didn't happen because of the storm." Her voice was low, steady. "It was us and I don't want the distance we had before." Jonas stood in silence for a long time. Then he stepped forward, placed his hand on her cheek, and touched her lightly, an unspoken agreement. "Neither do I." No confession, no grand promises. But their hearts had chosen one another, not through words, but through the peace of morning, through hands held a little tighter, through the gentleness only true love could bring. And from that day, they didn't just live together. They began living as husband and wife, quietly, deeply, in the only way that fit them. That morning gave no warning. It was simply a rare, quiet day in the west. Light wind, a gentle sun, the scent of damp grass lingering after the night's rain. Mara rose slower than usual, her hand resting on her stomach, in an unfamiliar habit she hadn't yet understood. Jonas was stacking wood on the porch. When she stepped outside, he looked up with his usual smile, then froze the moment he saw her face. "Are you dizzy?" "Just a little. It's nothing." He set the wood down and moved toward her quickly, placing a hand on her back without even thinking. "Come inside. Rest." The worry in his voice tightened something in her chest. She knew she had to say it. She couldn't wait any longer. Inside the cabin, as he set a cup of water in front of her, Mara drew a long breath. "Jonas, I think I'm pregnant." No thunderclap. No shock loud enough to break the world. Only a silence so deep Mara could hear the wind slipping through the wood. Jonas's expression shifted, as if color had drained from the world around him. Not because he wasn't happy, but because something older, sharper, rose up inside him. "Mara," he whispered, "are you sure?" "I think so." "Do you feel any pain? Short of breath? Anything?" His voice shook. His hands shook. Mara placed her hand on his. "Jonas, I'm all right." But even as she said it, something inside her tightened. Pregnancy in the West was no small matter. No doctor, no clinic near, no guarantees. And she understood perfectly why Jonas looked the way he did. His first wife, Annalie, had died giving birth. Their child died an hour later. That nightmare had never left him. And now, standing in front of the woman he loved, he felt it return with every breath. "Mara, if something happens to you, nothing will happen," she whispered, gentle as a hand on a storm-bent branch, but fear still burned quietly in her eyes. That afternoon, the sky darkened fast. A storm was building. Jonas went out to reinforce the old stall near the field, where the wind hit hardest. Mara, uneasy, brought rope and nails to help him. "Mara, go inside." "I'm fine, I'm only bringing—" A sharp gust hit. A cracking sound split the air above the stall. Jonas turned just in time for his heart to stop. A loose plank from the roof bolted straight toward Mara. "Mara!" He lunged like a wounded animal, shoving her into a pile of hay. The plank slammed down inches from her head, scattering dust in a sharp burst. Jonas wrapped her in his arms, holding so tight she struggled for breath. "Are you hurt? Does anything hurt?" "Mara, I'm fine, Jonas, I'm fine." But he held her as if letting go meant the wind would carry her away forever. Mara placed her hand on his cheek, guiding him to meet her eyes. "Jonas, don't be afraid. You almost died." "But I didn't. I'm still here." He bowed, his forehead to hers, breath fractured. And she knew he was fighting ghosts she couldn't see, trapped in a battle she couldn't fight for him. That night, only the rain remained. Jonas lit the fire, brought more blankets, warmed water, checked her wrist and back. Though she had told him 100 times, she was unhurt. "You have to be more careful," he said quietly. "I know. I don't want—" He stopped, swallowing something too heavy to speak. "I don't want to lose you." Mara sat cross-legged on the bed, her hand resting lightly over her stomach, where a small life had just begun. She was afraid, too. Afraid she might lose the only home she had ever known. Afraid she might leave Jonas behind. Afraid of repeating the fate of so many women on this harsh land. But as she looked at Jonas sitting beside her, his hand resting gently on her thigh, his eyes lowered with fear, Mara understood. They didn't only have fear. They had each other. She placed her hand over his. "Jonas, we will get through this." He looked up, eyes wet in the way only desperate men reveal. "You promise?" "I do. But you have to promise too." "What promise?" "That you won't let your old grief drive you away from me." Jonas didn't answer with words. He pulled her into his arms and held her as if holding a part of himself. Outside, the storm roared, but in the cabin, where the fire cast their shadows against the wall, there was a fear very real, a joy still fragile, and a love just beginning to find its footing in the wind. That afternoon, a soft gray settled over the Montana sky. Not a threatening storm, but a muted light, as if the day itself was preparing for something. Jonas was repairing the east fence while Mara gathered the clothes from the line. Her pregnancy was only a few weeks along. She felt well, but Jonas watched her the way a wolf guards its den, ready to step in the moment she bent too long. Mara was setting the basket on the table when unfamiliar wheels sounded at the front gate. She turned, breath caught. Jonas saw it too from across the yard. A small wagon stopped. The door opened, and the person who stepped out was someone Mara never believed she would see in a place this far from everything familiar. Aunt Ruth, the woman who had raised her since she was 13, and the same woman who once said, "A black girl like you doesn't belong in good places." Mara froze. Jonas glanced at her once, then moved to stand beside her, not asking, not assuming, simply becoming a steady place for her to lean if she needed it. Aunt Ruth walked closer. She looked smaller than Mara remembered, her hair more silver, her eyes less sharp, carrying something that looked like remorse. "Mara." Her name wasn't spoken with the old judgment. It was soft, and that softness struck harder than anger ever did. "Why are you here?" Mara asked quietly, her voice held tight. "I wanted to see you." Jonas stood silent. When he saw Mara clasp her hands together, he stepped one pace closer, not touching her, but close enough for her to feel his warmth. Aunt Ruth looked at Jonas with a measured glance, not hostile. "He is your husband?" Jonas gave a small nod. "I'm Jonas Ward. It's a pleasure to meet you." She nodded back and turned to Mara. "Could we speak alone for a moment?" Jonas looked at Mara. She nodded. He stepped away toward the barn, near enough to watch, not out of suspicion, but because he saw the strain in Mara's eyes. In the small kitchen, Aunt Ruth sat on the wooden chair, her hands trembling. Mara stood opposite her, keeping distance. "Mara," she began, her voice uneven, "I know you don't want to hear what I'm about to say, but I need to say it." Mara said nothing. "I was wrong. For years I thought I was protecting you, teaching you how to be strong. But the truth is, I hurt you. I made you believe you didn't deserve anything good, that you didn't deserve love or a life where someone chose you." Tears touched Mara's lashes, but didn't fall. The words felt like someone pulling out a small iron hook embedded in her chest for over a decade. "I didn't come to take you back," Aunt Ruth continued. "I came because I heard you left St. Louis without a word, and I was afraid. Afraid that something I said made you think you had no worth." Her voice shook harder. "And even worse, afraid you left because you believed no one needed you." A small sound broke from Mara's chest, not loud, but enough for Ruth to hear. "Mara, you deserve to live where people look at you with kindness. You deserve love and a good life." Outside the door, Jonas heard enough to understand. His hand tightened. He had never imagined that the woman who stood beside him each day, steady, calm, gentle, had spent years believing she wasn't worth staying for. It struck something inside him he didn't have words for, as if he was seeing a hidden part of her past, the part that made her step back whenever happiness came too close. Inside the cabin, Mara finally sat, facing Aunt Ruth. "You said things that hurt me. I know. But because of that, I learned how to stand on my own." Aunt Ruth's tears fell. "I only wish it hadn't cost you so much." Mara shook her head. "I don't blame you anymore, but I found where I belong." Her gaze slid to the doorway, where Jonas still stood, steady as a beam holding the house. Aunt Ruth followed her eyes. She nodded slowly. "I see that." She took Mara's hand, not to pull her back, but to acknowledge she had her own road now. "Mara, I'm proud of you." When Aunt Ruth climbed back into the wagon, Jonas stepped to Mara's side. "You all right?" Mara nodded, eyes red but lighter than before. "I'm all right. Just lighter than I've been in years." Jonas looked at her as if trying to gather all the unspoken wounds she had carried alone. "I didn't know you'd been through so much." "But I'm not alone now," Mara said, placing her hand on his. Jonas closed his fingers over hers and pulled her closer, a wordless vow. And for the first time he understood fully, Mara wasn't only the woman he loved, not only someone he wanted to protect from western storms. She was someone he wanted to heal, no matter how long it took. And Mara understood something else. Love doesn't erase the past, but it helps her stand firm when facing it. As Aunt Ruth's wagon disappeared over the ridge, Mara let out a long breath, light as someone finally setting down a burden carried since childhood. That morning, the sky was so blue it made Mara feel strangely reassured. But when the first pain tightened across her belly, sharp, deep, forcing her to grip the edge of the table, she knew the baby had chosen its day. Jonas was splitting wood outside. The moment he heard something crash in the cabin, he ran in like a storm. "Mara?" She stood braced against the kitchen cupboard, pale, one hand on her belly. "Jonas, I think it's time." Those 3 words drained the color from his face. He lifted her onto the bed, his hands shaking so much he dropped the blanket. "I'll get Mrs. Davis. Don't move. I'll be right back." But Mara grabbed his hand, breath catching through another contraction. "Jonas, don't leave me alone." He froze. His hand tightened around hers, trembling hard. The fear in his eyes was raw, cracking open old wounds. "Mara, you know, I lost Annalie on a day like this. I can't." His voice broke, crushed under memories he never truly escaped. Mara touched his cheek, steady and soft. "Jonas, I'm not her." "I know, and this child isn't the one from that day." He shut his eyes. It was the truth he needed most, and the truth he feared to face. Finally, he exhaled shakily. "All right. I'll stay. But I still need help." "Then go, quickly." He ran into the wind, returning with old Mrs. Davis, midwife of half the valley, breathless and still unable to fasten the buttons of his coat. Labor dragged on, long enough for the cabin's walls to feel like they were tightening around Mara's labored breaths. Mrs. Davis pressed a hand to Mara's belly. Her expression shifted, barely, but Jonas saw it. "What is it?" She avoided his eyes. "The baby's turned wrong. Difficult presentation." Jonas staggered back as if struck. No, it can't." He looked at Mara, her face pale, hair damp with sweat. She caught his gaze, weak but unwavering. "Jonas, come here." He knelt beside her, She gripped his hand, harder than she thought she could. Look at me, not at anything else. I'm terrified. I am too, but we survived a blizzard. We'll survive this. Mrs. Davis spoke sharply, but calm. Mara, push when I tell you. Jonas, support her back. He slipped his arm under her shoulders, letting her lean on his strength. I'm right here. Don't look away from me. The next wave of pain hit like a breaking sea. Mara cried out, voice cracking, and Jonas felt his heart shatter with helplessness. Mrs. Davis, please, help her. I'm helping, Jonas. Steady yourself. But he couldn't. The past was rising. The dark room, the scream, the smell of burnt wood, the doctor's voice saying, we couldn't save them. Another contraction seized her. She cried out, nails digging into his skin. Jonas bent close, voice breaking. Mara, stay with me. Don't leave. Me. Don't. Jonas, she gasped, cutting him off. Look at me. Trust me. He did. And in that moment, the panic in his chest loosened because her eyes, still fierce, still present, held him steady. All right, Mara, one more, Mrs. Davis called. The final pain tore through her. Mara cried out. Jonas held her as if holding his whole world together. 1 second, 2, 3, then a cry, a sharp, powerful cry cutting through the thick, breathless air of the cabin. Mrs. Davis lifted the newborn, wiped him clean, and turned with a rare, warm smile. A boy, strong and healthy. Jonas bowed his head into Mara's hand, a broken sound slipping out. A man pulled back from the edge of a cliff. Tears fell onto her wrist, hot, heavy, unhidden, and Mara cried too. Jonas, she whispered. I'm here. I'm right here. Mrs. Davis placed the baby on Mara's chest, skin to skin, breath small and warm, still trembling from the journey into the world. Mara looked at him, then at Jonas. We did it. Jonas touched his son's cheek with a shaking hand. The first time he allowed himself to touch a newborn without ghosts dragging him under. Thank you, his voice cracked, for coming back to me, both of you. Mara smiled through her tears, lowering her head to kiss the baby's soft hair. This is our home, Jonas, now and always. Outside, the wind softened, slipping across the porch like a blessing. Inside the quiet cabin, 3 bodies rested close. Jonas's first real family since the day tragedy took everything. And in that fragile stillness, Jonas understood. The old pain had finally stepped aside, making room for a first cry, and a future he never believed he could have again. Spring came that year as softly as a new breath. Snow thinned into pale streaks along the road leading into Willow Bend, and the wind carried the faint scent of early grass hiding beneath the warmth of the season's first sun. Mara held the baby close against her chest, wrapped in a cotton blanket, while Jonas walked beside her, one broad hand shielding both mother and child from the breeze. They came to town at Reverend Thomas's invitation. He wanted to bless the newborn and officially welcome their family as part of the community. It wasn't a simple ceremony. For Mara, it was proof that the hard years in St. Louis, the cruel words and the wary glances she endured when first arriving, had finally begun to fade. When they reached the square, townsfolk were preparing for the spring fair, hanging ribbons along porches, setting up pie stalls, tying flowers onto wooden arches. A few people waved when they saw Jonas, but when they noticed Mara, carrying the baby tucked into her arms, their movements slowed. Slow, yes, but not out of suspicion, out of surprise. Then their expressions softened, as if they finally understood she wasn't a mail-order wife, wasn't a stranger passing through, but someone who belonged to Jonas, and therefore belonged to this town. Mrs. Perkins, the same woman who once watched Mara with quiet caution, approached first. "Mara, dear, let me see that little boy." Mara hesitated. Jonas rested a steady hand on the small of her back, wordless reassurance, enough to help her breathe easier. She lifted a corner of the blanket. "This is Caleb." Mrs. Perkins studied the baby, slow and thoughtful, then smiled, a warm smile few ever saw. "He looks just like Jonas." Laughter rippled through the circle of neighbors. A few men clapped Jonas on the shoulder. He only gave a modest grin, but Mara saw the way his shoulders eased, like some invisible weight he'd carried for years had finally begun to fall away. The blessing took place inside the small church at the end of the street. As candles were lit one by one, their soft glow fell over Mara's dark, glossy hair. Jonas stood beside her, his hand resting instinctively on the back of her chair, always guarding, always steady. Reverend Thomas looked at them with a kind affection Mara had rarely received from an elder outside of Aunt Ruth. "You two have walked a long road to reach one another," he said gently. "I will not speak of losses past, because today I see a family before me, born of courage, choice, and a love that endured." The church went quiet. Mara looked at Jonas. Jonas looked back. In that dim light, the moment felt like a second wedding, this time with no vows, no papers, just the trust in each other's eyes. When the ceremony ended, the Reverend laid a hand on Caleb's head. "May you grow in love, in peace, and beneath a roof built from your parents' own hearts." Emotion rose like a tide in Mara's chest. And Jonas, though he turned his face ever so slightly, could not hide the glimmer in his eyes. As they stepped outside, the entire town lined up along the church steps. No one asked them to, but they all clapped. A long, warm applause, quiet enough not to startle the baby, yet strong enough to make Mara bow her head and hide against Jonas's shoulder. "Mara," Jonas murmured near her ear, "do you see it?" "See what?" "They accept you." A breathy, surprised laugh slipped from her. "I know, I can feel it." Jonas stopped right there in the middle of the yard, one arm curling gently around her waist, the other securing Caleb. "Listen to me," he said softly. Mara lifted her gaze. "From today on, no past will hold us back. Ward Ranch is your home, our home, and Caleb will grow up there, with more laughter than sorrow." Mara laughed through tears, quiet, like the sound of early wind easing through a doorframe. By late afternoon, Jonas held the reins, helping Mara up onto the horse first, before placing Caleb in her arms. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Yes," she said, warm and sure. As they rode back across the pasture, the sunset washed the ranch in honey-colored light. Mara looked at the wooden cabin, the place she once entered with trembling fear of being abandoned, and for the first time saw it as truly hers. She leaned her head on Jonas's shoulder. "I feel like we just began a new life." Jonas covered her hand with his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "No, Mara." His voice was low, steady. "This is our life." And for the first time, she didn't just believe him. She felt it, deep and certain, as if the sunset itself painted one word into her heart: home. Summer followed summer, and winter returned like an old friend who knew every door and every path. Life on Ward Ranch no longer carried the turmoil of the early days when Mara and Jonas first found each other. It had grown steady, full, and honest, like an old wool blanket mended with careful, patient stitches. Caleb grew strong, his deep brown eyes like his mother's, and his slow, warm smile exactly like Jonas's. When he turned 2, Mara was pregnant again. This time, Jonas didn't panic the way he once had, though he never stopped checking the windows 3 times or waking in the middle of the night to make sure she slept well. Their second child was a girl. Mara named her Eliana, God's light, because she believed the same hands that had pulled Jonas back into peace would guide their children too. Eliana had soft curls and a habit of touching Jonas's short beard every morning. Caleb followed his mother everywhere, while Eliana clung to her father and Jonas. Jonas melted at every laugh from his daughter, like a man who never believed he'd be given the chance to be a father again. Ward Ranch grew over the years. Another field, another stable. Rows of trees Jonas planted at Mara's request. "I want the children to have a place to play when they grow up," she said. Jonas only nodded, then planted more than she asked for. People from Willow Bend visited the ranch more often. They brought pies, milk, and stories. Mara had become someone everyone greeted at the market. She was no longer the mail-order wife from St. Louis, no longer the unfamiliar colored girl, but a woman who belonged here with her whole heart. Sometimes at night, after Caleb slept and Jonas finished locking the barn, Mara stood on the porch watching moonlight spread across the field. She remembered the early days, the poverty, the fear, the aching loneliness. And then Jonas would step behind her and place a warm scarf around her shoulders, a quiet reminder she would never stand alone in the wind again. One early autumn afternoon, with yellow leaves scattered along the trail behind the ranch, Jonas asked Mara to walk up the hill with him. Caleb ran ahead while baby Eliana slept in the wooden carrier Jonas had built himself. At the top, the breeze moved gently across the soft grass, carrying the scent of warm soil and the first chill of the season. Below them, Ward Ranch stretched wide, new barns, grazing patches, and the narrow silver thread of a stream lining the field. Jonas stood still for a long time, looking at the land he once thought had taken everything from him, and somehow had given it all back. He turned to Mara. Her face in the late light wasn't dazzling or sharp, just quiet, steady, the kind of peace that made his heart soften in ways he still didn't fully understand. "Mara," Jonas said, low and thick with something he hadn't spoken before. "Yes?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Before you came, I didn't think I had anything left worth living for. I was moving through days out of habit. No hope, no expectation, just trying to get through without hurting too much." Mara took his hand, silent, letting him continue. "But then you came into my life. Not loudly, not asking anything, not forcing me to forget what I'd lost. You were simply here, with me. And somehow, you mended everything I thought would hurt forever." Jonas looked down at their joined hands. "If not for you, I wouldn't have Caleb. I wouldn't have Eliana. I wouldn't have this life." Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Jonas, you healed me too. You gave me a home, a family, a place where I don't have to prove my worth every single day." The wind carried the scent of dry grass and mountain air, the smell of the West changing seasons. "I think," Jonas said quietly, "this is the first time in my life I understand what real peace feels like." Mara smiled. "So do I." They stood on the hill, watching sunset wash the land they had built together, built with fear, with tears, with courage, and above all, with a love that wasn't dramatic or hurried, but strong enough to change the course of both their lives. Below them, Ward Ranch stretched wide. Not just a home, but the legacy they would leave for the children, running beneath the morning sun. Jonas wrapped an arm around Mara and drew her close against his chest. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Mara placed her hand over his. "A long way," and the right way. The sun dropped behind the horizon, leaving a faint, ember-colored glow across the prairie.